until brands basically commit to paying more and making less, everything else is a drop in the ocean.
Today's episode on the podcast is a little bit different and very exciting. Not only is it the first time I have a guest join me on the green sofa, but it was also a real eye-opener for me listening to Mel chat about things that I wasn't quite certain of myself. And I learned a lot in this podcast, and I hope you do too. I hope you find it entertaining. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we discussed, and make sure you've subscribed to this podcast if you haven't already. But yeah, let's get into it. Do you want to introduce yourself first, Mel?
Yep. Hi, I'm Mel Watt. I am a fashion campaigner working primarily on issues of waste, poverty pay and greenwashing in fashion. That looks like a real variety of things. It looks like making educational and hopefully funny skits on social media, doing some workshops and lectures, planning some actions and working with organisations like Fashion Revolution and Changing Markets Foundation.
And you're working with Fashion Revolution when we met, right? We met at like a networking event.
Yeah,
and
Claire Press's book launch, I think.
Yeah, I didn't realise you were working at Fashion Revolution, but we followed each other like already on social media. And then I went to your Stitch in Person day on Fashion Revolution.
Public Day.
That was so good. Like, congrats on that.
Thank you. We didn't bump into each other. I was running around like a headless chicken.
No, but when we met, I didn't realise how ingrained you were in Fashion Revolution and like how on board you were with all their campaigns there and like all of their work towards building a better fashion industry. So it's nice that you've come on and we're going to talk about that today, like as someone who's an expert in behind the scenes, like how brands should be doing better. We should probably figure out what the current state of the industry is before we go into all the ways brands are getting it wrong. Brands are rolling back on their ESG claims. They're going back on climate commitments that they made and like quietly doing that, you know, not really saying we are not going to hit these targets. They're just like making them disappear. There's also been a lot of them cutting sustainability roles, like cutting funding in sustainability. Yeah. And it feels really like there's almost a deprioritisation of sustainability in fashion right now, and a lot of focus on very public facing events that make it seem like they're caring more about sustainability in consumers' eyes rather than looking deeper into the issues of fashion and like systemic change that could actually be making a massive difference.
I definitely agree. I think the brands, at least the brands that we're going to talk about today, I think pretty much across the board systemically, I would say big fashion brands, that means fast fashion, sportswear, luxury, all of the big giants that we see pop up again and again. They all have, if you look in the right places, really loud sustainability commitments, but they're not allocating the resources or the willpower to actually deliver at speed the structural changes that we actually need. And these aren't under-resourced brands. They're some of the most profitable players in the world, usually owned by billionaires. So it is definitely a deliberate choice in what they put their money into, what they call solutions, which actually, looking at the larger picture, are very often tokenistic moves that sadly won't move the needle anywhere closer to where we really need them to be.
Yeah, definitely. One article I was reading about around Fashion Month was talking about how there was a lot of performative action at Fashion Month. I actually, in another video, talked about how that was my takeaway from a lot of sustainability at Fashion Month. There was a lot of big visual campaigns towards brands saying, hey, we're trying to do this, we're trying to do better. But like when you look at the reality, when you look at the statistics from reports like the ones you've worked on for Fashion Revolution, it's just not, it's not there. It's not reflected.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because sustainability always did feel like a trend. Up until maybe a few years ago, when we've got the kind of the regulatory reckoning, we're starting to see, oh, okay, in a few years we might have legislation come into place, which we are starting to see. Brands are going to take this more seriously, there's going to be repercussions. And I feel like we've now gone backwards and sustainability is a trend again. I work with a really wonderful woman, also De Castro. She co-founded Fashion Revolution, and she has a book called Love Goes Last, and she's very well known for saying, pops up all over Instagram, that sustainability isn't the trend. It's been trending, it's been around for billions of years, otherwise we wouldn't survive without it. Fast fashion is the trend. And she did a video recently and said, no, I can't stand by those words anymore. Sustainability feels like the trend, and everything that you've described, all of these kind of cutbacks, kind of rejigged commitments, it really does feel like we're not taking it seriously anymore.
No.
But nothing's changed.
No. I read a report the other day that showed that fashion is very, very good at making out like they're going to do better, like they're setting targets. They ranked highest for ambition and goal setting out of all the other industries, but they were actually the lowest for resource inflows, like putting that money where their mouth was.
Yeah, I think this is by design. There's so many buzzwords, initiatives. It's not on the average consumer to easily spend hours doing research to understand this. It is a really murky kind of environment to navigate, and so I understand how difficult it is, and I think brands actively capitalize on that confusion and in most parts contribute to it. And I think, yeah, when you invited me on, I wanted to talk about how brands are putting all of their energy into the wrong things, because that too is by design. What we're seeing is, and I'm sure we will come on to positives at some point, but what we're seeing is all of these schemes essentially amount to green capitalism, which is business as usual, i.e. the things that got us into this problem, dressed up as change. Behind the scenes, nothing has changed. The profitable and exploitative business models remain the same. It's just the window dressing that changes, right? And that is what I've seen again and again and again. And it's frustrating because they put out these news and initiatives into the world that make us think that we're so much further along, that progress is being made, and we're being lied to. It's not true. We're not seeing the structural change that we desperately need to change the fashion industry, an industry that was designed to be broken. And so until brands basically commit to paying more and making less, everything else is a drop in the ocean. But the brands aren't going to admit to this, and so it just feels like we're going round and round in circles when actually little, if anything, has changed.
Yeah, and I feel like brands make out that what you said, like, it's a massive issue, but it's just not. Like, there's so many things that they could do quite, well, maybe not quickly, but like they could do that would have such a big impact. I mean, just like producing less could solve so many issues.
Yeah, and if we take that a few steps back, actually something that brands could do overnight would be to disclose their annual production volumes. Now, this is information any viable business knows. They have to keep track of this mass inventory. And the reason that they don't share this information is because it would become an accountability mechanism.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be able to, put their hands up and say, oh, we're not part of the problem.
Yeah.
It would show how much that they overproduce, somewhat, if not a lot, independently of consumer demand. It would force them to reckon with the environmental and social impacts of their business, commit to degrowth, take responsibility for the waste they produce. And so they do not share this information. And wonderful organisations like the All Foundation, which is based in Ghana and is probably one of the biggest recipients of our clothes, a lot of it very poor quality, are fighting for brands to disclose this information in a campaign called Speaks Volumes, because we can't even start really meaningfully tackling this issue if we don't know the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
Fashion Revolution always say you can't fix what you can't see.
Yeah.
And estimates vary, I think something crazy between 80 and 150 billion garments a year, which is a massive data gap, but we just don't know.
You can't even fathom it. Like,
no, you can't picture it. And until brands kind of share this information, we kind of circumvent this issue.
Yeah.
But actually we need to have a refreshing level of honesty and transparency if we are really to meaningfully tackle the issues of waste and overproduction.
Yeah, it's that same hands-off approach that they have to suppliers, right? It's like, we don't directly employ people, so we don't have to know what's happening in our factories. And it's like, why do you think that level of non-accountability is okay? Like, why do you think it's okay to say that you don't know what's happening in your factories and that's like an industry standard? Like, why are we not questioning that more? Why are we not questioning why brands don't know how much they're producing or don't know how much they're producing?
Yeah, I actually was doing some research on H&M the other day, looking at kind of what their stance is on labour rights and living wages, and they were very quick to put up there in the copy saying, while we don't directly employ these people to kind of create some distance, but they're very much his responsibility there, because that is the essence of their model. These people who make their clothes, their business and their successes would not exist without it. And so there needs to be accountability there.
I think just overall, and like the overall topic of this video is just like brands are trying to distract us, trying to like, you know, do big, bold public statements that say, oh, we care about sustainability, and systemically nothing's changing.
Definitely, that PR machine is working overtime. There is a huge gap between what brands say and do. There's so much more emphasis on commitments than there is talking about progress and impacts. And that's exactly what greenwashing is. It's a delay and a distract tactic. So we aren't looking at the real issue. I think something that I will repeatedly say today is that, okay, that's great, but it's not getting to the source of the problem. We need to tackle the problem at its root. And that is just not what we're seeing. Yeah,
I think one of the ways this comes up is through fabrics and through the amount of polyester we use. I mean, I'm not an expert. I know you've worked on a report that talks about our synthetic fabric usage.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I was on kind of the designing the social media post to really promote and launch it. I didn't write the report, but it was by Changing Markets Foundation, and it's called Fashion's Plastic Paralysis. And I think that's a really great title that captures what is going on right now in fashion. Brands say that they are trying to be on this journey to sustainability, but the hard facts are that synthetic usage, i.e. polyester, nylon, continues to skyrocket, and I'm sure their overall volumes with it. So this report was looking at big fashion brands across all sectors, luxury, sportswear, fast fashion, high street, you name it, and kind of how they're tackling this issue of synthetics. What it found is the vast majority of brands, that synthetic usage is increasing, some quite exponentially, but actually they couldn't with clarity say that for a lot of brands, because they just wouldn't share the data. Just as we're seeing, they won't tell us how many clothes they make, they won't tell us how many synthetic clothes they make. So that continues to go up. All the while, these brands don't have any policies to address microplastic pollution, which is a big issue with polyester clothing. Microfibers are found in all clothings, and the impacts of that vary. But when polyester is the most used fabric globally, microplastics are a big issue, and they found that they didn't have any real meaningful solutions, which should be, again, tackling at the source, stop making polyester clothing, and instead of using a lot of delay and distract tactics, things like recycled polyester, well, marginally better than virgin, you know, it still produces microplastics. You've recycled it once, it can't be infinitely recycled. A lot of it comes from plastic bottles, which could have been recycled more if they'd stayed in that loop of recycling. And this huge transition to recycled polyester is again another way to not have to get their hands dirty and do the real good thing, which would be just making less of it. Other things are they are emphasizing scientific uncertainty about the impacts of microplastics, but you would have seen in the news it's been found in placentas, the brain, breast milk, testicles. There is tons of research about the environmental and health impacts, and really there's no excuse. Instead, what are they doing? They're saying, oh, use a guppy bag, which is
This is the thing. I feel like all of the microplastic discussions are very customer centered. It's very like, here's what you can be doing. And it's like, well, what are you doing? Like,
it's
why
passing
are you not
on responsibility to us to try and catch those fibers, because when we wash our garments, they shed a lot.
Buy a specific like microplastic catching washing machine. Have you seen these? Like, what do you mean? Like, am I spending £1,000 on this?
Honestly, and even then, okay, great, I've got the microplastics. I still have to put them in the bin. They're still gonna
like, where are they going?
in landfill. So yeah, of course we can all play our part, but it doesn't feel like a very fair equation when the people creating the microplastics aren't doing anything about it.
No, they're just pocketing the profits of using synthetic fabrics, which are much cheaper than natural fibers, and, you know, looking the other way when it comes to the impact of doing that.
Yeah, and that will be the theme for today's video.
That will be the theme. Well, One of the interesting things you just mentioned is how the report looked at different parts of the fashion industry. Like, I feel like fast fashion is immediately what comes to everyone's mind, but they also looked at sportswear and luxury industries and found that those are very, very polluting too. And I just think that's funny that even within the industry, it feels like there's a scapegoat of fast fashion and the rest of the industry wants us to focus on those particular brands when, you know, it's an industry-wide problem.
Yeah, it really is the embodiment of that Spider-Man meme, right?
Yeah.
They're all pointing at each other because they don't want to take on that responsibility. You see fast fashion CEOs saying that they only produce in response to demand. You see the billionaire owner of LVMH say that luxury is sustainable by nature. But what people are noticing, that actually, if you have overlapping supply chains and scandals, of which there were many for them this summer, people are really starting to question what is the difference beyond the markup.
Yeah.
And the same thing with sportswear, a bit of a trickier subject because with performance wear you do need an element of stretch.
Yeah.
But even then, polyester synthetics, they're not breathable fabrics.
No.
And so I think, yeah, you've really hit an important sort of point in my work. It's kind of why I use this encompassing term, big fashion.
Yeah.
Because it really is systemic industry-wide.
Yeah.
And we can't just look to the same names to change. We need the entire industry to change.
Yeah.
And ultimately what these brands share is the moral responsibility, the global influence over production countries, the money, the access to customers to truly educate. They hold the purse strings and the power to really bring about the change that we need, which is a bit worrying because
you can't trust them to do the right thing.
Exactly. You can't trust a criminal to write the law, but with the kind of the work I do through kind of collective action and legislation, the reason that we focus on these brands is because if they really kind of transform their business model, then the industry, we could be talking about entirely different things today, which is my dream. I want to write my job out of existence.
Exactly. I was speaking to a brand actually the other day that tackles clothing poverty in the UK, and the founder Sol was saying something really funny. She was like, I want my business to go out of business. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how funny is that when the fashion industry is so obsessed with profit and growth?
Yeah,
and like
we have opposite intentions.
It's so, and how do we like bring those two together? How do we get these two parties to work? It's going to be hard, but it can be done.
I think it can be. It's very difficult, but yeah, I have to have hope. Otherwise, what's the point?
Exactly. And actually, I wanted to ask you, one of my hopes is legislation. I know when we were talking before, you were saying like legislation is something you're waiting for to bring about quite quick change. One of the things I've talked about on this channel as an idea of mine is a lot of legislation seems to be focusing on the biggest players right now. You know, Shein, Temu, you know, those ultra fast fashion companies that are churning out millions of styles, way more than we ever need. But it means that maybe some of the spotlight isn't being shined on smaller offenders, but, you know, brands that we still need to tackle, we still need to rein in. And I kind of wanted to know your thoughts on whether you think it's a good thing that we're tackling the biggest fish first, or whether you think it should be overall systemic change that hits as many companies as possible.
I don't think these things happen in a vacuum. So I think while we are seeing, you know, in France and areas such as that, focus on these specific brands, we are also seeing perhaps at EU level the wider kind of casting of a net.
Yeah.
I do think it's important when we talk about these issues to recognise, like you say, that it's systemic. I think that there's also, to use a recent example, there is a campaign called Say No to Shein, which is trying to block them from listing on the London Stock Exchange, and that's an example of a really specific brand targeted action. But if the government were to block that application, it does set a precedent.
It does, yeah.
Where, okay, you can't have exploitative supply chains and be a public company. And so I do think there is merit to these legislations because they're not happening in isolation.
No, that's really interesting. I do think there is merit in the idea that even if laws are tackling one company in specific, it will definitely still impact smaller companies. Any change is good change at this point.
I think we need to take victories where we can get them. And there is an obvious reason why these retailers in particular are being targeted. I think for many people, they represent the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And so if that's the ceiling, the benchmark, and those practices become heavily regulated, then the hope is there's no aspiration or ability to get to that level.
It's true,
again. But yeah, I do think we need legislation, particularly in the UK, where we're desperately like
lagging
behind. Exactly. And so I think when we hopefully come to see that regulation being introduced, it will be across the sector and beyond fashion as well.
Yeah. I guess one of the other things I think brands really aren't focusing enough on is decarbonisation. I mean, I did a report on here about the What Fuels Fashion campaign report that came out. I think it really did well in focusing on a big issue in fashion that could have got lost if it wasn't the main part, which is decarbonisation and how brands still haven't tackled fossil fuels in their supply chain, right? Like it could have easily been buried in the report of how sustainable are brands being and how are they tackling all the wide issues. But no, I really liked how the report immediately focused on what fuels fashion, like how is this a big issue?
Yeah, I think the report and the campaign did two things really well. I think the first was to recognise that sustainability is made up of two halves, the environmental and the human. And this is why, in part, why greenwashing really annoys me so much, is because it just puts up a smokescreen that really paints an illusion of progress, and it really emphasises the environmental at the expense of the social. Like, okay, they're using better materials, now I'm not thinking about who actually made them. And so when we talk about decarbonisation, we need to make sure that we are creating a just transition, that we're not changing the business model and leaving the millions of people employed suddenly left behind. We want to make sure that they're consulted with, because these brands have really big sustainability ambitions, but the report found that most of them didn't create them in consultation with the suppliers, aka the factories that will have to implement the changes, because the biggest impacts are in those raw materials and processing and factories, and those are where the biggest impact lies. So you can't set these ambitions on behalf of suppliers and then not consult them or co-finance them.
And most of the emissions from a brand's impact come from scope 3, right? Like the very low level
upwards. Like the vast majority. And I think the second thing it did really well was make people realise how much the fashion industry is in bed with the fossil fuel industry. Because I hope there's widespread awareness that polyester comes from crude oil, is essentially fossil fuels. But actually fossil fuels are found throughout the supply chain. Even natural fibres, you've got to put petrol in the machinery that harvests it. Maybe you've got oil-based dyes, you've got coal-powered manufacturing facilities. It's everywhere. And that's why decarbonisation, not to take away from all of the social issues we need to change, is such an important issue.
And I know on social media we talk about big oil and we talk about big fashion, and it's kind of ironic, it's kind of like a funny name to laugh at them a little bit, but it kind of does encompass like the power between the two of them and really how powerful they are. Like fashion holds a lot of cultural power. It's really important that we hold them to account.
Absolutely. I think the fashion industry provides social license for fossil fuels to exist.
That's interesting.
I think I couldn't say with certainty, I'm sure there's research out there, but I would be surprised if the industry wasn't maintaining, if not increasing, demand for fossil fuels at a time when the scientific consensus is that we need to move away from them. We see more overt examples of social license, which is essentially where we give the fossil industry cultural relevancy. It's normalised, and this happens from quite a young age. I think Shell used to partner with Playmobil on kind of sets. They're in Fortnite. Big oil companies sponsor exhibitions or literary festivals, and that's being called out But what we don't connect that dots with is how wearing clothes that are made from and with fossil fuels is helping to normalize its existence too.
Yeah.
Because if moving away from fossil fuels means moving away from the vast amounts of polyester that make up the current business model, you are going to fight for its survival. And so I think it's another way we don't think about how normalized fossil fuels are in our everyday lives. They're very much in our wardrobes.
And I think there's also the idea that COP was held in the UAE last year.
The petro state.
And at the conference, the leader said something to the effect of, there's no science behind the unsustainability of fossil fuels, or I can't remember the actual quote.
Yeah, you had just as many fossil fuel representatives as you did the alternative.
But yeah, if you have this kind of messaging happening at an event that is meant to be talking about the future of our planet, and like the one space maybe that is all about sustainability, then how can we expect people to take it seriously? How can we expect us as, you know, citizens to believe that the people in power are taking it seriously?
Yeah, and Fashion Revolution provided the kind of only official agenda event on fashion. It's an industry that's very much missing from the conversations at COP, which to me is ludicrous, because when you realise how much fossil fuels are embedded with the fashion industry, they absolutely need to be at this table and being told, you need to decarbonise now.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways otherwise that we can see that brands aren't taking it seriously is just the lack of decarbonisation strategies or like future plans in their sustainability reports that they all put out every year, and really push as like, here's our transparency guide, here's why we're so amazing at sustainability. Like, decarbonisation is just lacking.
Yeah, which is really surprising given the kind of the urgent need to do that. The What Fuels Fashion report found that a quarter of the brands, so this is 250 of the world's largest fashion brands and retailers, disclose absolutely nothing on decarbonisation, and the vast majority of the brands do not have clear targets on various areas of decarbonisation, like using more renewable energy or phasing out coal. And where they do have more visibility tends to be at a scope 1 and 2 level, which generally means the offices and the kind of the electricity that's used to power those offices, maybe company cars, things like that.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of those emissions happen at scope 3. So if a brand is saying, oh, we've got carbon neutral offices, that's great, but that's like 5-10% of your impact at a very push. Like, the vast majority of your carbon footprint sits in the production of your products, and that's where you need to be putting your intentions. And I think also we've seen across the industry various ways of brands getting out of, again, doing the proper thing. So we've seen a lot of carbon offsetting, which is just pushing the issue further down the line. There's no incentive to actually reduce emissions at the source, and there's nothing to say that they actually work, especially as brands keep producing more and more. And in a related note, there was a really interesting report looking at the luxury industry, again, very much far from perfect industry, that found a lot of brands are setting intensity reduction targets rather than absolute reduction targets, which means that they are trying to reduce the footprint per product, which means if they can continue to increase that product range, they can report a decrease in emissions, even though the absolute emissions has continued to skyrocket. And so it's a very clever, complicated maths equation I don't completely understand, but what I do know, it's a way to make them seem like they're doing a lot more than they actually are.
And I think that's the thing, right? Like, you don't know how it works, and you work in the industry. Like, how is people like watching this, like, that aren't in the industry, supposed to know that? Like, it's just designed to keep us in the dark. It's designed to, like, again, give fashion all the power, even down to them saying like, oh, sustainability is so hard, we don't know how to work it.
Yeah,
it's not true.
The What Fuels Fashion report concludes that this is not a matter of feasibility, it's a matter of willpower. The solutions exist, we're just not using them.
No, because it's not profitable. Like, that is just the boiling point. Like, it just comes down to profit and greed and capitalism.
essentially. And it's a very lucrative industry, and that's why the kind of key call to action for this campaign is to put your money where your emissions are. We need to see brands co-finance decarbonisation in supply chain. We can't leave it to already indebted suppliers who are in an equal power dynamic. And we did see a number of brands like H&M and Gap come together for this collective financing, which on paper is what we need more of. We need industry collaboration, but conveniently left out of the press release, and only when you really dig into the fine print you realise that these were loans to suppliers, which is a form of finance, but actually it's just exacerbating debt and that unequal power dynamic. Brands need to actually commit to spending some of this millions and billions themselves. You know, most of these suppliers aren't paid nearly enough, which means the people who actually make the clothes, who are employed in these factories, earn poverty wages. We're seeing this at the moment in Bangladesh. This was a real opportunity for brands to live up to what they say they do, and that's support living wages. So in November of last year, the minimum wage revisions came about in Bangladesh. This happens every 5 years or so. And garment workers specifically demanded 23,000 taka, which research shows is the bare minimum for them to live a decent, dignified life and be above the poverty line.
It's not asking for much, but...
No, it's not a living wage. It's just the bare minimum you need to live. And all of these brands with these living wage commitments basically said nothing. They didn't support the workers' demands. Now, this is really important because if a production country, most of their exports come from the fashion industry, those fashion brands have really a lot of power to dictate the working conditions in that country. Because if they don't support a rise in the minimum wage, the country will be worried that they'll just go to their neighbours next door and then nothing changes. And so we really needed brands to put their influence to good use, and they didn't. The actual minimum wage increase, as you can imagine, was pitiful. It was nowhere near what garment workers demanded. H&M at the time heroically said it would assume the cost of the increase, which was barely an increase at all. And at the time of the predominantly peaceful protests, 131 workers died, and blanket arrest warrants were put out for workers, 40,000 of which are still standing now, almost a year later. And so Clean Clothes Campaign and Labour Behind the Label were really looking to these brands to again use their influence to get these arrest warrants dropped, because it's collective. It includes people that weren't even in the area at the time, and it's an intimidation technique which meant that the wage revision process was completely undemocratic. And brands are always looking for these opportunities to do the right thing, and then it's handed them onto a plate and they do nothing. And that's why a year later on the anniversary, we're really looking to these brands like H&M, Inditex, who owns Zara, PVH, who owns Calvin Klein, Bestseller, Primark, Next, Battleland, all of these big names, to call on suppliers, on these factories owners, on the government to drop these charges and stop people potentially being imprisoned for life for simply demanding their basic human rights are respected.
Hearing that is it's just insane. Like, obviously you had the Bangladesh protests over the summer, like that whole situation, and there were a lot of brands coming out to say, oh, we stand with the suppliers, even though they've been closed down for a couple of days, we're not going to pull our contracts and stuff. But you also had conflicting reports coming out that brands were doing the opposite. It's hard to know which report was right, but I'm not going to give the benefit of the doubt to the fashion brands.
I mean, we only need to look 4 years back to COVID. Practically all of the big fashion brands mass cancelled apparel orders from their suppliers, orders that had already been processed, and the fallout was catastrophic. The impacts of poverty wages were only exacerbated. People were really destitute, they couldn't provide for themselves or their families, and it was a humanitarian crisis, and it was only through collective action and public pressure that billions in stolen wages were won back. But to this day, so much of that has never been repaid.
I mean, I feel like we've been talking, you know, sort of historical cases. I mean, showing that this has been an issue for a while, and, you know, brands aren't paying for the things that have happened in previous years. But One thing I think that shows that the issue is still ongoing and brands are not learning is the Primark campaign that recently came out. And I read what you wrote about it on social media, but I want to let you like explain the whole thing because it was so good.
Thank you. I will try my best to recap, but I have to first take you back a year or so. So a new piece of research comes out. It's done by a university, but it's co-financed by Primark.
Yeah.
Leaving us to question, like, what's the motive?
Who's bringing the money?
Yeah. And what the research did, it tested quite a number of garments of the same sort of quality and product type and price ranging between £5 and £150. And it tested them for wear and tear, aka physical durability, how much can it withstand damage, that sort of thing. And at the time, it didn't disclose what the material of the garments being tested was, which was a bit questionable because research usually discloses its methodology.
Yeah, you normally have that sort of thing
to give
in a research
it credence,
paper. Yeah.
Definitely. And it's only a year later that we find out that the clothes are cotton. And we find out because Primark comes out with this durability framework, which is based on the report with added input from WRAP, which helps brands to address waste and become more circular through voluntary initiatives. And it says in this press release that it used cotton. Now, this is surprising for two reasons. It's surprising that they was testing with cotton in the first place, because actually polyester is the most used fibre globally. Yeah. And Primark...
something you'd associate with Primark as well.
And Primark is full of synthetic clothes. You know, even a lot of the times cotton is blended with other fibres. Yeah. And it was also questionable that they just didn't include it in the first place. Like, it's just not standard practice.
Yeah, a research paper from a university, you have a methodology section that outlines all that.
It was definitely meant to be a more accessible read, but I don't know why that means you wouldn't include that information. But anyway, going back to the report, what it essentially finds, in not so surprising terms, is that there is no correlation between price and durability. Right. So something could be really expensive but fall apart, and something could be really cheap and last longer than the expensive item. I say it's not surprising because the differences between luxury and fast fashion are becoming fewer and fewer.
But it's definitely a rhetoric that serves Primark. And it's funny that, you know, as the sponsors of this report, that's what the finding is, right? Like, it's not a coincidence.
But this has led Primark to essentially make durability their main metric of sustainability. But I think there's a number of reasons why that's a misplaced emphasis. Okay. I think number one, just because something can exist forever doesn't mean it should. There's this term going around, forever fashion. Yeah. And of course, synthetics by definition are durable because they take ages, and I mean ages, to decompose in landfill. Well, they never properly decompose. They break down into microplastics. They're not biodegradable. So anything that fits this criteria is by definition durable. And so if you're using that as your sustainability metric, you then have in your mind sound justification to increase your use of synthetics. And Primark disclosed in that report we were talking about earlier of its plans to increase its use of synthetics in future.
I did not know this.
It could be recycled polyester, it could be virgin, but the point is they're going to continue to use it and increase it. And if you're saying, yeah, it's durable, then you can get away with it. The second thing is emotional durability. So how we care for and use our clothes is far more important and a more accurate depiction of how long an item will actually be used for its total lifespan. And Primark would love us to believe that their clothes hold emotional durability. But I think when you're a front runner in the fast fashion space, or at least you were for many, many years and then still up there, how do you reverse decades of messaging that say the opposite? Primark is a very different brand in the sense that they didn't have an e-commerce site for years.
Yes, of course.
You only had to go in store.
Famously, yeah.
They don't do big advertising campaigns like their competitors, but they did help normalise the idea that a t-shirt should cost the same as a coffee.
Yeah, and they are actively putting out clothes that are in the trend cycle.
Yeah. constantly churning that over. And their answer to that is that they're going to educate their customers on how to repair, which is all great. But when you've helped warp our sense of value, I just don't know how achievable that aim that is when your competitors are continue to price so low, adopt FOMO marketing and all of that. And also there was a report called The Plastic Elephant in the Room, which also discounted this idea that just because you buy something durable, that it will have a very long lifespan, or that it will prevent a new purchase of clothes. Very rarely do we buy a new item to replace a worn out version. We just keep accumulating clothes. And I think maybe most importantly, the third thing, I don't care how durable it is if it was made in exploitative conditions. I really think the human capacity to withstand pressure and change is just as important as the planet. So if this £5 t-shirt is going to last forever, but it was made by someone without freedom of association, without fair pay, I don't care. They shouldn't have to endure that for the sake of a durable garment.
And I think that is something that fashion so often leaves out. And when we're talking about what fashion is focusing on and what they should be focusing on, materials is a very easy thing to focus on. It's something that consumers would notice if you're using better materials. You increase your cotton, your organic cotton amount in your collections. That's something that the consumer will directly know about. They'll feel their clothes and they'll understand that you're using a better material, say. But consumers wouldn't necessarily know if you're paying your workers a living wage. It's not a consumer facing tactic for sustainability. So brands probably often think that it's not something to be focused on. Like, it's this whole cause and effect relationship of what they should be focusing on versus what they think consumers want to hear, I guess.
Yeah, and I think if we take your example of a brand is genuinely using better materials, which is hard to define because no fabric or fibre is about its impact, that is obsolete if you're mass producing it and the people who made it did so in exploitative conditions. That undermines any of the potential goodness of that choice, and that's why we need to approach things holistically, and we absolutely cannot miss the human element out of the sustainability question.
Yeah, I think often it's very easy for us, for people listening who are in the sustainable fashion space or want to know more, to feel like there's no hope, like to feel like they can't do anything. So I guess I've got two questions I want to ask you. First is, what can people listening to this video do to help the situation? How can they feel like they can make a difference here?
It's a big question. I think I find it really interesting actually that whenever I mention I work in sustainable fashion, people immediately jump to the question, where should I buy? How should I buy? What should I not buy? And while that is very well intentioned and is kind of symptomatic of how we've been led to believe that we can consume our way to change, it is misplaced. And actually that change first starts when we see ourselves as a citizen and we start taking collective action with others. I think unless it's on a very mass coordinated scale like the BDS movement, which calls for specific boycotts, individual boycotts don't tend to have any impact on a business model. And so I think I really focus on taking collective action. What might that look like? It might be supporting the work and campaigns of organisations like Clean Clothes, who win back stolen wages for garment workers and who only take their cues from the people who make our clothes. So you're tangibly helping to improve their lives and remedy specific labour rights abuses.
And also give them a seat at the table, right? To get their concerns heard.
Yeah, and they're constantly sharing their testimony and they do really great work. Same with the Remake, who had the Pay Up campaign. You've got organisations like Fashion Revolution and Changing Markets Foundations who all provide easy ways for you to take action, whether that's commenting on a social media post, emailing a brand, contacting your MP, it could be signing a petition, things like that. And we have had a lot of tangible victories. It might seem like a really small, insignificant action, but when you're taking it with lots of people, brands care nothing less than their reputation.
Yeah.
And so you can hit them where it hurts in that sense.
I think it's going back to that idea of like setting a precedent. from before when we were talking about legislation. It's like, well, if one brand sees that another is being called out for this specific thing, then they're going to be more mindful of it in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about legislation, supported a campaign called Good Clothes Fair Pay, which was pushing for EU legislation, which would basically secure living wages for garment workers worldwide. And for that, we really relied on citizen signatures. At the EU level, they're talking about the digital product passport, which would essentially provide you a lot of information about how your clothes came into existence. And so Fashion Revolution recently did a survey to help prove that people do care about that. But if policymakers don't do that, they're not going to act in this common interest. And so it's really about making our voice heard and visible and showing solidarity with garment workers. They are best placed to know about the changes that we need in our industry. And so if we take our cues from them and work with them and not on behalf of them, we can get a lot of change. And we have. History shows it works.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to mention is you keep using the word citizen, and I think that's something that's really important. I often use the word consumer on this channel, and there's obviously connotations to both words, and I really think I need to stop using the word consumer and change it to citizen, and, you know, invite the idea that we have a certain power instead of being victims of brands and at the whim of what we buy and being defined by what we buy. We need to see ourselves as people who have different kinds of power, you know, collective action and political power. And yeah, I think that's a really actually nice term and something I might take forward.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a whole other podcast, so I'll try and keep it succinct. And I want to preface this by saying I'm a hypocrite. I only buy secondhand. I don't really buy from the brands I campaign against, but I don't see that as creating systemic change. I just see it as something that soothes myself, because I've removed myself from this really detrimental trend cycle, detrimental on my mental health, and that becomes a precondition for action. It clears up mental space to put effort into the actions that will cement change, however incrementally. Consumer reduces us to how we shop, and I think it's a product of neoliberalism, but the essence is we've been taught we are what we buy, and that we leave it to the market to get cues from us to implement social change. But we've have enough decades to see that brands aren't changing, and this a notion that brands are going to solve everything is not coming into fruition. If anything, they're just trying to promote change while not changing their business model at all. And so I also want to note that citizen is an imperfect word in the sense that it's been used very historically and politically to exclude people, decide who's worthy and who's not. But what I think it speaks to, when used in context, is someone who sees themselves as having agency, who doesn't see themselves as an isolated individual, but as part of a community, because that's something else neoliberalism did. It made us just think about our own self-interests. And so you see yourself as part of a community, you recognize that you can hold collective power and you exercise it. Yeah. And you stand in solidarity, you question things, you're just an active participant of the world that you live in.
So if you're watching the video, or even if you're listening to it, you can probably tell Mel and I have changed setting. Unfortunately, there was a technical difficulty on my end, which meant that the recording cut off. Thankfully, it was almost right at the end, so we got a lot of our discussion, but it did cut out one of my favorite parts of the video, which was where I asked Mel what gives her hope for the fashion industry. And I think it's really important that we talk about this as people who work in the industry. Obviously, we see a lot. We should probably be more pessimistic than most. And I think it's really important that we talk about what makes us feel like there is change happening despite all of that we see, basically. So yeah, Mel, I want to ask you please to repeat what you said about what gives you hope in the fashion industry.
Yeah, thanks. I think hope is a really important thing to cling on to, especially when this work can lead you very prone to burnout, anxiety and emotions such as that. And I also think it's really important to resist the urge of hopelessness, because that is an emotion that corporations probably actively promote and actively benefit from if we think that alone and collectively we can't change anything, then nothing changes. And so hope is a really powerful emotion that I tap into as often as I can, even in those more difficult hair pulling days where it really does feel like we're going around in circles. I think linking to the discussion we were having about consumers versus citizens, I think something that definitely gives me hope, whether it's through my own work or someone else's, is that magical light bulb moment where someone comes to the realization that they're not just a shopper, they're so much more. They're an individual with agency and they have a stake in the planet that they live on. And I think it's really beautiful and empowering to reject the narratives we've been told since we were very little that we should leave everything up to the market to solve. So that's something that definitely gives me hope. Another kind of facet of neoliberalism was to promote individualism, individual self-interest. And so my antidote to that, because I really believe in sort of embodying the values I want to see in the world, is community. And this career has thankfully gifted me so many wonderful people from all corners of the globe who are individually fighting for change in their own context and culture. And to be able to lean on people in tough times, in moments of solidarity, to uplift each other's work is really beautiful.
Oh, that's really lovely. Yeah.
Another more practical source of hope is the emerging legislation we're seeing across the globe, particularly in the EU at the moment. There's a lot of potential loopholes. It will be interesting to see how much it will actually be enforced, and it can definitely be strengthened in places, the UK among them, which is very much lagging behind. But when we have been calling for legislation for an end to the era of brands marking their own homework for years and years and years, it definitely feels like a really important step in the right direction to see regulation emerging. And then a more light-hearted source of hope that I've really discovered this year has been craftivism, which uses crafts, whether that's knitting, embroidering, crocheting, as a form of protest. We obviously met at Mendon Public Day, and that was a physical manifestation of craftivism, but it comes in lots of forms. And what I really love about it is it teaches us that you don't have to be an activist, you don't necessarily have to push yourself out of your comfort zone and do things that you don't enjoy. You have to find those things that you do love and that you are good at, and you attach them to a wider cause. And craftivism is definitely a more gentler form of protest, but it's not one that exists in isolation or opposition to more traditional forms of banner waving, megaphone shouting activism. It allows for peaks and troughs, to be on the front lines and then to retreat to the home, to practice slowness as we so encourage and ask and urge from the fashion industry. It almost seems silly to say that certain things that were very much normalised in the past are now radical acts, repair being among them. We only have to look back to the make, do and mend era of World War II. But it is true that in our very fast-paced throwaway culture, being intentional, choosing to keep, choosing to mend, rather than find yourself trapped in this endless cycle where nobody wins, it can be a radical act. And we met at Mendon Public Day. One of the posters we had, lovingly designed by Molly Portis, was "Repair is a Revolutionary Act." And we had lots of different craftivist organisations there. We had Street Stitching, who form essentially conga line in the form of camping chairs. They set up camp and they get on with their individual crafts, usually stationed in bustling consumer places. And it's a really striking visual contrast, and they drum up conversation with shoppers. And it's not a place of judgment. It's not about calling out, it's about calling in. We also partnered with the Craftivist Collective, and they have a brilliant activation called Mini Fashion Statements. They gift you a scroll of paper, and they give you the Craftivist Collective stamp, which you push out onto the page, kind of like a stress relief, the idea being that you kind of get out all of your frustration. And then you're given 15 minutes or so to really intentionally respond to a prompt that you're given. And at the end, you roll up that piece of paper, tie it cutely with a bow, and you are encouraged to shop drop it, which means go and put it in the pocket of items on sale in clothing stores. We obviously can't track the impact of it, but Crafters Collective hope that it will spark curiosity. And they also told me of an instance of one woman who didn't want to shop drop it, so instead put it in her handbag, and every time she went to grab her purse, it would provide a reminder and make her think about whether she really needed to make this purchase. Other examples are Transform Trade have been calling for a UK fashion watchdog. So they called on the making community to handcraft little dogs. Some were made out of felt, some were stitched, some were drawn. Cute. And to send them to the desks of MPs around the country. And I think that's such a brilliant way to cut through the noise of the usual communication channels. So those are just some of the things that give me hope, and they're things I cling on to in times of joy, but also in times of stress. And I think we all need some hope in our lives.
You gave so many good examples there. I have so many things to look up now. So thank you so much for that. Look up those little felt dogs, because oh my gosh, what a great way of trying to get your point across, right? And I know I have a few people who follow me on here that are really into knitting. So potentially this could be something that you guys get involved with if you have a skill in knitting and you want to use that for good. But yeah, I guess thank you so much for coming on and speaking. And it's been so wonderful. I have learned so much from you. So yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Make sure if you've really enjoyed what Mel has to say, then you go follow her on her platforms. It's Instagram_Mel Watt and Substack Caught Green Handed. Yeah, go follow her on all her platforms. She has so many good things to say. And make sure that if you're not subscribed to my podcast, then you do. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.
Bye.